there will come a point where no job is needed. You can have a job if you want to have a job. The AI will be able to do everything.
AI could wipe out half of all entry-level white-collar jobs in the next 1 to 5 years.
I don't know if any of you have used one of these like AI customer support bots, but it's incredible.
Welcome to AI Unplugged, the future of work, unlocking the promise and peril of the algorithmic age.
Erik Brynjolfsson is a world-renowned economist, author, and inventor at the forefront of the digital economy. He is a professor, senior fellow, and one of the most cited scholars at Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI. He co-authored best-selling books like The Second Machine Age and Machine Platform Crowd. He's also the co-founder and chairman of WorkHelix, an AI platform designed to help large enterprises turn the promise of AI into measurable productivity gains. And I learned just before we turned on the record button that he is also a very wise former voter in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Welcome, right, Erik, to AI Unplugged.
It's a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you after voting for you, and looking forward to a fun conversation.
Appreciate that. You've been studying the economic impact of technology for decades, but it feels like right now AI is having its moment, a kind of a printing press meets electricity moment. And given all the excitement and the risk of what you call the Turing trap, which I hope you'll also explain for our listeners what you refer to there, why is this moment so pivotal? And how do we make sure that AI augments rather than replaces human potential?
Well, there's a lot in that question to unpack. I've been looking at AI for basically all my adult life. Actually, even before, it was a fun thing that I did when I was a kid and a teenager. At Harvard, along with Todd Lufborough, we taught a course on building expert systems, these rule-based systems, back in the late 1980s. And so I've always been pretty excited about the potential of AI. I have to say that there's been nothing like the current era, though. The past 4 years, 5 years, things have just exploded. Mm-hmm. The ability for the machines to be able to learn much more rapidly from large amounts of data has taken off. People are putting a lot of scale into it. And it's not just me that's surprised. I was talking recently to Demis Hassabis, Google DeepMind CEO, who's visiting Stanford here. And he said he was surprised. He's been studying this. He's a genius looking at a lot of this stuff for a long time. And he said he did not expect, the transformer architecture, the LLMs, the large language models, to be as powerful and as effective as they are. And of course, now all the frontier labs are pouring a lot of energy into them. And almost every week we see some kind of a benchmark being blown through, whether it's the Math Olympiad gold medal or a programming competition, or just, all of us using it ourselves. And we can see that when you ask it a question, it can give some pretty intelligent questions. Also, sometimes some dumb answers and some hallucinations. It's a bit of a jagged edge, but at its best, it's as good as a very smart human.
And the Turing trap?
So the Turing trap is this danger that I think we're heading towards. A lot of your listeners will be familiar with the Turing test, this iconic idea that Alan Turing put forward, that the ultimate measure of artificial intelligence was if you could make a machine that was indistinguishable from a human. And when I was a kid, I thought that's the coolest thing. Someday maybe you won't be able to tell whether it's a machine or a human. There's obviously science fiction stories about that, et cetera. It may be a cool, inspiring idea, but I think it's actually a terrible economic or business concept. Trying to make technology that closely mimics humans is the last thing we should be doing. In fact, it has two big problems. One is that, with all due respect to us humans, the ceiling isn't high enough. I mean, we should be doing much more than matching humans. It would have been lame, I think, if Henry Ford had said, hey, I'm going to make a car that can walk or run as fast as a human and go on 2 feet or whatever. That's not the way to build technologies that really expand our set of goods and services. Secondly, and more perniciously, if you make a machine that is a close substitute or even a perfect substitute for a human, well, economists know that tends to drive down the value of human labor, drive down wages, and it leads to more concentration in wealth and power in the people who control the technology, who control the capital. Now, there is another way, and that is to have machines that do things very different from us. Instead of trying to do things that are easy for humans and hard for machines, we should try to do things that are hard for humans and easy for machines. So not like buttoning shirts or doing simple tasks that a 5-year-old can do, but rather doing complex optimization or scanning through millions of documents. Even a calculator can do a lot of things that I can't do. So there's a lot of headroom to do new things and different things. If we do that, and if we complement and augment what humans are doing, then we make human labor more valuable, and then we increase wages, and we create more widely shared prosperity.
We will certainly come back to that topic some more. Warren?
Erik, one of the challenges, and both Deval and I have been impact investors now for some time, but one of the challenges that you see in the world of private equity, you see it in the world of public equity, is companies are always under pressure to improve productivity, to reduce costs. Yeah. And that's the kind of thing that you can often see in the bottom line fairly quickly. And so if you can create AI that's effective at replacing human labor, that can be a fairly quick benefit to your stock price or whatever it is that you're trying to do to drive value.
That's right.
How do we ensure that more executives think along the lines of what you described about augmentation of human potential and true partnership with machines, as opposed to just creating a whole new set of problems along the lines of the outsourcing and offshoring problems that we've had over the past 20, 30 years? Well,
first I'll say that, sometimes it is good to cut costs, and there are a lot of things that people do that are, boring or dirty or dangerous, and it's okay, sometimes to do that. But I think there's an overemphasis on it, and CEOs, executives, technologists are often too quick to look for the cost cutting. And in a way, it's a little bit of a lazy approach, because what you do is you look at what you're doing right now and you see, what a worker's doing and think, hey, how can I replace that? How can I have a machine do the same thing? It doesn't take a lot of creativity. On the other hand, coming up with new things to do is harder. It requires more creativity. Economists don't often like to talk about culture, but I think part of it is a culture, vision, mindset thing that when I talk to CEOs, I tell them, look, you need to think more broadly and not just look at the easy wins, the cutting the costs. Nothing wrong with doing that from time to time, but the more sustainable competitive advantage comes from doing something new that none of your competitors are doing, that you were never doing before. And then you have to step back and be, frankly, a lot more creative. So that's step one, is that creativity. And by the way, it applies to technologists too. I gave a talk at a big AI conference a while back, telling them a little bit about what I just said to you guys about how the Turing test was a mistake. And they basically came up to me after and said, yeah, we hadn't really thought of it that way. If you are making the case that we should design machines that complement people, we can do that too. We can augment as opposed to just replace people. So there's a lot of things we can do culturally and mindset-wise, and part of it is just this discussion. There's also things we can do in terms of financial incentives. And I was just talking to a group of folks from Congress yesterday who were visiting here at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. And we were talking about some of the ways that tax policy, right now, American tax policy, and frankly in most countries, has the thumb on the scale steering technology and entrepreneurship towards replacement and automation rather than augmenting and expanding human wages. And the way they do that is that taxes on capital are much lower, about half as high as the top taxes on labor. If there are two entrepreneurs, each of whom have an idea, whichever idea has more labor is going to get taxed more, and the idea that has more automation is going to get taxed less. So that's not what we want to be steering technologists and entrepreneurship towards. We should level the playing field and treat them more evenly. And then there are a lot of more subtle, nuts and bolts things you can do with worker training and investments in different kinds of technology that would also steer us more towards augmentation versus automation. But coming back to my first point, it all starts with a different mindset, realizing that automating is not the only way to create value.
I want to come back, Erik, in a minute to this policy question, because I think that's critical. But this idea of culture and this idea of thinking more creatively, more about augmentation, I think one of the things you warned at Davos this year was there's a lot of executives, there's a lot of folks spending lots of money, billions and billions of dollars on AI, and still not getting it right. In fact, I think you said that billions have been wasted. Yeah. How do you make sure that these experiments, this creativity that you're recommending, is actually successful?
Well, part of it, comes in addition to the culture and sort of the policy and tax things, It also comes with people being more creative about the KPIs that they're tracking and not just looking at the financial cost cutting. The CFO of a lot of companies often has an outsized voice in this, and that it's easy to measure certain things in dollars and cents. But there are other things that matter to all the shareholders and stakeholders and workers in the organization. For instance, when we looked at the introduction of a large language model in a call center, what we found was that there were a dozen different KPIs that you could measure. You could certainly measure productivity metrics like average handle time and completion percentage, but you could also measure worker turnover and worker satisfaction. You could look at the transcripts themselves and measure customer sentiment and worker sentiment, basically how many happy words and angry words there were. You could measure customer satisfaction with net promoter scores. So there is these broader set of metrics that you can measure that take into account how you're creating new kinds of value, not just cutting costs. And in this particular case, all of those metrics improved. So it wasn't just the dollar savings, but it was also workers were happier, they learned more, they were more likely to create good answers on their own, even when the system got shut down. The customers were more satisfied. The sentiment in the transcripts was happier. So I think when you think more broadly like this, then you naturally start steering towards using the technology in ways that are beneficial on multiple fronts.
Can I just pick on that a bit, Erik? Because I think what you're saying is you have to be intentional as someone, as an executive or a manager introducing AI. And I think one of the things we see and that you're touching on is that there's sometimes a gap between what workers want from AI and then what AI agents actually are built to do. And I'm interested in where you see other examples of that kind of misalignment and how you counsel folks to get ahead of that.
Yeah, it's something I've noticed anecdotally in talking to people. And recently we did a paper to quantify that, working with Di Yang and Yijia Shao and a number of other folks here at Stanford. We surveyed about 1,500 workers. And I'll tell you in a minute about how we surveyed them, because that was kind of innovative. But to get to your specific question, we asked them what they were looking for from technology, what parts of the jobs they really hated and they wanted to have automated and eliminated, some of the routine scut work, what parts they really enjoyed and had fun, the often interacting with other people or the creative parts. And then we compare that to what the AI agents were actually doing. And the sad thing is there was basically zero correlation. If you think of like 4 boxes, high, low, and you have a 2x2 grid, there were data in all 4 of those boxes. You could have stuff that workers wanted and the machine was good at. That's great. We call that the green zone. But you also had a lot of stuff where workers really did not want it automated, but it was being automated. And you could also have things in the other 2 quadrants. And so one of the things that paper, which was called The Future of Work with AI Agents, Auditing and Automation and Augmentation Potential Across U.S. Workers, one of the things that paper did was basically show you how you could align the capabilities better with the worker preferences. And let me, as promised, get to the way we surveyed it, because this is something that Yijia and Dee introduced to me. There are a couple of computer scientists here at Stanford. I moved over from the economics building to the computer science building to be closer to people like this. They created this voice agent, and it was just wonderful because it was an AI agent that could go out and interview workers and ask them about what they were looking for, what they liked, what the tasks were. And it was interactive. And it was just incredibly engaging. We played around with it. Workers seemed much more willing to have conversations rather than like type stuff into a survey. So we got much higher response rates. And on the back end, we got all this text, all this content that they were generating. We converted it to text. And you could do natural language processing on it to distill out the concepts, understand what were the tasks. I think this approach is going to get much more common, where AI agents interact with humans, voice agents interacting with other agents. We're just going to see a proliferation of technology helping us understand the workforce better.
Well, one of the things that, and I hope, Warren, you'll go to this, just this whole idea of reskilling workers, the disruption for some workers will be real. And then, how do we get ready for that? Yeah. Warren, you want to head down that path?
Well, I guess one question, Erik, is what kind of reskilling is required in a call center context? I mean, isn't there a world where the idea of the call center worker it goes the way of the dodo? I mean, I wonder if you push the analogy of what you just described far enough. You've got an agent that can go off and interview a worker. At what point are we going to be looking at customer service agents in call centers that are entirely automated?
We are seeing a lot more of that. In fact, a new project I'm working on is one where it is largely automated. What we're seeing, though, is that there's sort of a hierarchy of complexity of tasks or uniqueness of the tasks. In the first paper, in fact, we saw a bit of this as well. If you look at how often different questions come up, there's some very common questions. Hey, I'm locked out. How do I fix my password? And there's some medium questions, and there's some very obscure questions. Machine learning is great when there's data, and those are available in the common and medium questions. But that long tail of questions that were relatively unique, the machine struggled with that. Machine learning doesn't have the data to learn the correct answers. But humans did somewhat better. I wouldn't say they were great at it, but we could kind of muddle through, even if we haven't seen it before. That pattern continues to happen even as the agents get better and better. They work their way down that curve and are able to handle more, but humans, at least for the foreseeable future, have an advantage in dealing with exceptions. We also have advantages in dealing with defining what the problem is. So in many cases, the machine can be very good at executing once you've defined exactly what needs to be done, but asking the right questions is something that humans are needed for. And finally, I would say for verifying whether or not the results are correct and is what you're looking for, often you need a human for that as well. We've all had experiences where we ask an AI to generate something. It's not really what we're looking for. It's just plain wrong. And having a human in the loop does a lot to verify as well. So if you think of 3 stages: defining the problem, executing it, and verifying it, humans are especially good at the first and last. And teaching skills to strengthen that is something we could do more of.
But Erik, on this point of there are exceptions that right now the machines don't do a great job of, and so they kick it to a human. But each time they kick it to a human, they're creating more data about how to deal with the exception.
Yep.
And so, these solutions today are as bad as they're ever going to be. They're only going to get better from here.
That's a good way to put it.
And so at some point here, I can imagine that we're going to be creating the data that's going to make those exceptions fewer and fewer. Is that a fair concern?
I think, the key words there are at some point, and I don't know how far off that is. It's further than I think most people would imagine. When we scope this, it sort of looks like a power law. So I don't have a whiteboard here. I'm a professor, and I kind of want to go up and draw something. But, there was this long tail of obscure questions. And I don't know how long that tail is. It's probably not infinitely long, and eventually machines can work their way out further and further to the tail. But it's longer than I think a lot of these people, including me, realized. In 2012, I was out here visiting California, and I hopped in a Google car with Andy McAfee, my co-founder at WorkHelix, and we drove from Mountain View up to San Francisco. I'm not making this up. There's pictures of us, and we wrote about it in our second Machine Age book. And I was like, hey, we're practically there. We drove all the way up Route 101, a little fine-tuning and some of the left turns or whatever. I was so wrong. Now it's 2012, and although you can drive around San Francisco and you can drive around Mountain View starting recently, you can't drive between the two of them yet, or ride between the two of them, I should say, in a Waymo car. I'm sure that will come soon, but it's been 13 years, so it takes a little longer than people realize. And to be honest, even a self-driving car is less complicated than a lot of the tasks that knowledge workers do in medicine, law, elsewhere. So I think we're going to have some number of years, decades, where both humans and machines have something to add. The boundary will keep moving, but there will be a period. But to agree with you, I do think at some point, I don't think there's any metaphysical reason that machines can't at some point match humans just across the board or exceed humans across the board. And we are getting closer and closer to that. I don't know when that will come, but I don't think that there's a magic thing that prevents that from ever happening. It's just that the technologists I talk to, a lot of the executives I talk to, I think even I've been guilty of myself, overestimate the ability to automate things. More often than not, the way to use an agent or an AI is to have it empower a person to do the job better rather than try to do everything from soup to nuts autonomously.
That sounds so right, but I think I also hear you acknowledging the premise of Warren's question, which is that to some extent we're all engineering our own obsolescence. The further up the sort of information or complexity chain we go, and if to the extent that may not happen quickly, and that there are opportunities for people to develop skills that are better suited for the more complex, the inquiry, the question, and the problem that's to be solved. I want to think about also how we deal with the economic disruption to workers. You know, you think of, and you touched on this earlier, as generally speaking, over the last several decades, the worker's share of total income, of total productivity, has been shrinking. And with AI accelerating change, how urgent is it that we think through what is sometimes described as the redistribution question? Or are there policies like universal basic income or robot taxes or the taxes on capital that you talk about, or co-ownership models, which I'm really interested in and been trying to explore myself? Do you think that these are other ways that we could restore a balance so that the folks who are most exposed to AI replacement or displacement aren't just, kicked to the curb?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was John Maynard Keynes who said that when the facts change, I change my mind. And I put myself in that category now. Back when I wrote Second Machine Age with Andy McAfee, I was pretty opposed to universal basic income. I kind of went through the math of it, and it just didn't add up. It was very expensive. And also, I didn't see technology rushing forward as fast as we talked about at the beginning of this program. Now, I do see that rather than say, 2060 or 2080 when AI starts matching us, it may be a lot sooner, and we need to start preparing. And so I'm bringing in some of my expectations, and I think we should start experimenting. We are starting to experiment with universal basic income, also a variant that I kind of like called universal basic capital, where you give people a stake in the society, not just sitting back and collecting income, but they have some ownership as well. Mm-hmm. That said, I don't want to set aside the thing that I said in my last answer, which is that we want to have that runway where humans and machines are still involved. Having humans have economic value is a great way to give them bargaining power, and it's the best way, I think. And that gives them a lot more leverage, not just economic bargaining power, but ultimately political bargaining power. So we should be looking for ways to have AI augment workers for as long as possible, while also on our other hand, preparing for the day where fewer and fewer workers will be able to have that kind of economic contribution. And we need to have alternatives like universal basic income and universal basic capital. My other big fear for universal basic capital, aside from just the cost of doing it, the cost is going to be addressed as the technology gets better and productivity grows. But the other fear is this bargaining power. And I think we haven't thought enough about it. I'm beginning to write a paper on that with Zoe Hitzig of Harvard. And we are thinking through what it might mean politically to have people just receive income without being part of the production process. And I'm kind of concerned about the potential for centralization and imbalances of political power, and we need to think that through.
Erik, you talked a little bit earlier about the tasks themselves and which tasks are things that workers would be quite happy to get off their plate, which tasks are things that they actually enjoy doing and feel fulfillment in. I guess a couple of questions. One is, in a world where the AI keeps getting better, do you see a sort of purpose problem emerging for workers where as machines continue to be able to do the things that they do, and maybe some of the areas where they find fulfillment, do you see that becoming an increasing problem for society beyond the sort of immediate policy questions of redistribution? Maybe that's the first question.
It is a challenge, and I also wrote about this in Second Machine Age. The great sociologist Bob Putnam talked about people who got cash handouts, and economists say, hey, that's great. You don't have to work and you get money. But it turned out they were miserable. And so it really wasn't a solution. There's an old saying that work solves three great evils: boredom, vice, and need. And you can solve the need part with cash, but there's a purpose part and understanding what you want that's important to do. That said, I think it's a solvable problem. I think that a lot of us, my generation, have been very conditioned to think that work is what makes us valuable. And I love my work, and I do get a lot of meaning from it. But one can imagine, it's not that hard to imagine, if I hang out with my kids, teenagers who are very happy on weekends and on vacations and doing games and other activities and competing in those, finding fulfillment in basketball or surfboarding or lots of other activities. I can imagine that we sort of, over time, get satisfaction from those kinds of interpersonal interactions and not just our work. Part of it, again, is going to be a cultural transition. But it's something we need to pay attention to, because if we aren't intentional about it, the way Deval was saying earlier, I think that we could mess up, and a lot of people end up feeling that their lives don't have the meaning that they should have.
In the near term, it does feel like there's an opportunity, I mean, to take tasks off people's plates where they don't find fulfillment. So,
yes.
One of the things we've invested in a handful of healthcare companies. And one of the things surprised me as we did the sort of task-based analysis that I think that you referenced earlier, as we sort of analyzed our companies, we found that within healthcare companies, you think of them as these caring economy companies that have lots and lots of patient service. But in fact, about 50% of the time they spend is actually on documentation and things related to compliance and all kinds of tasks that are fairly rote and not particularly fulfilling for the workers. How do you direct inside of an organization AI first to those areas? And is WorkHelix part of that solution?
Yes. So WorkHelix very much applies this task-based analysis. We go into companies and we break down everything they do into processes and occupations, and every occupation is a bundle of tasks. And for each of those tasks, we can score how useful it is to the company and the worker, and also how well AI can do it. And that gives people a data-driven roadmap. And there are many examples where you can take some unpleasant tasks or low value tasks off a person's plate and use AI to help with them. You were mentioning healthcare. I just had an experience when I visited my primary care physician. And as she was interviewing me, she told me, she knew I worked in AI. We chatted, and she told me about this AI system they had, which recorded and transcribed the entire conversation, but not just word for word. It organized it into a medical note. It chopped out all the chit chat we were having and summarized it in a medically accurate way. She sent me a copy of it afterwards, and I was super impressed. It came almost immediately afterwards, so it wasn't something that took a lot of time. She said she was loving it because of exactly what you're saying, that previously she was spending a lot of her time on writing up and transcribing those notes, and now she just had to read and verify it. And there are a lot of jobs in the economy where or a lot of tasks, I should say, where it's a lot easier to verify something rather than to create it from scratch. And so even when the AI isn't perfect, it can still save people a lot of time.
I would just want to jump in. I just wanted to ask about the question of ethics and judgment.
Yes.
You think about one of the use cases we hear about today, AI in recruiting and talent management issues. And if the basic kind of technology is learning from the past, that includes bad habits from the past, right?
That's right.
That can also include bias and unfairness of one kind or another. Is there such a thing as an ethical AI in HR tools, for example? And how do we think about assuring that as we turn more and more over to AI, that we're doing so wisely?
Well, this is a super important question, and I'll give you some bad news and some good news. The bad news is that the AI learns from us, and we are filled with biases, prejudices, errors, and so it can just not only replicate those, but amplify them at scale, take small problems and make them into big problems. And that's happened in some situations. At the same time, the good news is that in many ways, AIs are easier to fix than humans. So, people go through training programs to try to remove the biases, but the truth is, that those judges, those doctors, those bank loan officers, those hiring experts, they continue to have a lot of implicit and sometimes explicit biases. With a machine, it's easier to say, hey, look, let's look at 1 million resumes, and maybe we take out some of the obvious kinds of biases, race, gender, whatever, but it still could pick up on some subtleties. Let's compare them to the outcomes, and we can tweak the parameters in such a way that we reduce or mitigate those biases. I didn't say eliminate because it turns out that conceptually it's almost impossible to fully eliminate all biases just because there's many different kinds. Mm-hmm. And if you eliminate one kind of bias, you can end up amplifying a different kind of bias. And ultimately, what this technology does is it forces you to be explicit about some of these trade-offs. If you have some false positives that creep in, and unless you've got a perfect system, then by reducing those, you may increase the false negatives. And you have to have some trade-offs about those different kinds of biases. But I think it's better to be explicit about them and incorporate those trade-offs. And ultimately, there's been research in parole, in medical, in loan officers, and hiring, in all those areas by top economists and researchers that found that you could not only reduce bias, you could also increase performance at the same time. You could get basically better outcomes on all dimensions by using the systems effectively. So I'm hopeful that over time, these tools will help us reduce bias in our society, even as they improve performance. anecdotally, I was talking to my Uber driver. I'm sort of an amateur sociologist sometimes when I talk to them, when I ride in an Uber. And I was asking him, he used to be a taxi driver, and he said he way preferred the algorithm for allocating the rides. He said the old human taxi dispatcher he felt was always kind of biased against him. I don't know if that was true, but that was his perception. And with the machine, he at least felt he was getting a fair shot.
It sounds like in that HR example, there's still a place where human judgment assesses the feedback you get from the AI model. Is that wrong? That there's still some...
Well, I think, you have to sort of decide what kinds of trade-offs you're willing to tolerate or you're interested in tolerating.
Yes.
So far, there's no perfect system, so it's going to make different kinds of errors, and then you have to be explicit about it. I think that's painful sometimes to be confronted with some of those, and it may seem better to just let them happen sort of like in the flash of an instant as somebody's making a decision and hiring rather than codifying them. But I think it's ultimately healthier to codify what some of the trade-offs are you're willing to make.
We've talked about some of these big concepts around ethical choices, around meaning in work, around economic displacement and some of the solutions or responses to that. And in a couple of your responses, you've talked about the importance of our or we being thoughtful about that. Who are we talking about here? Is it a public sector challenge? Is it a private sector challenge? Is it an individual challenge, or is it some mash of all that? And how is that balanced?
Well, I'd say it's all the above. I won't kind of shake my head when I say a mash. I'll just say, it is all of us. And this is a really important theme in a lot of my writing and my thinking, is that I think we all have more agency than we realize. And one of my frustrations is when people come to me all the time and ask, hey, what's technology going to do to us? Is it going to increase inequality? Is it going to lead to more concentration of power? And I'm like, no, you're thinking about it backwards. AI is a tool. We make those decisions, whether we are workers, whether we are managers, whether we are voters and citizens. We have a lot of choices that we can make. And as the tools become more powerful, that means they can change the world more. And in a way, we have more agency. There's only so much you can do with like a spear or a rock throwing against a wall. But with these incredibly powerful technologies, often in the hands of individuals, we can make a real dent in the universe. And that means that our values are more important than ever. And we need to think harder about what kind of a world we want to live in. And so I want to get people out of this sort of passivity trap of like, hey, technology is going to do stuff to us, and turn it into more of a mindset of what can we do with the technology to make the world better.
Well, and this is, Erik, this is part of the reason why Deval and I decided to launch this podcast is in order for we as citizens to be more effective, we first must be educated and to understand what the trade-offs are around AI. And I too, in some of the writing that Deval and I and others have done around impact investing, we sort of point out that we humans have agency as voters, as you point out, as consumers, as investors, and as workers. How do you what do you think are the most effective ways, and we can put pressure for this to end up the right way? These are powerful tools. Yeah. These are tools that can be used for good. They can also be used in other ways. Yeah. And one of the areas that that Deval and I are focused on is as impact investors. How do we hold companies more accountable in our roles, in our governance roles, in our roles as investors in companies? How do we actually help companies to see the more enlightened path, the augmentation path, the long-term path that you describe?
Well, first off, let me just say, I don't want to make you blush, but I really admire what you're doing with the Future of Work Partners and this podcast. And I wish more people were thinking like you are to make that part of their mission, part of their goal as an investor, as a CEO. I was just listening to one of your fellow VCs, Steve Jurvetson, and he said that he had discovered that the mission-driven companies that he invested in did much better than the ones that were trying to maximize shareholder value, which he called kind of vapid and vacuous. And so I think this is a place where the old Milton Friedman teaching or Michael Jensen that we shouldn't have a mission was completely wrong. Is not a trade-off that if you do a mission, that means you're doing less for shareholders. It's actually the opposite. And we found this in Work Helix, that we inspire our workers. They're excited to be having a mission to empower workers and to change the world. And it's true at a lot of other companies. And that's something that gets people, gets them to wake up in the morning. You were talking earlier about meaning, and meaning comes not just from collecting a paycheck or collecting a dividend check. It comes from doing something that makes you proud of changing the world. That's what gets people up in the morning. So I would say, we should all lean into your approach and what I hope is my approach of being mission-driven and intentional in trying to use these technologies to make the world a better place. Now, then we all have to sit down and think harder than we have been about what exactly those values are. Our philosopher friends need to pick up the pace. I sometimes tease some of them. I've been talking to them about they've been working on these questions for a few thousand years, and now with the power of AI, we really don't have much more time to sort out exactly what our goals and align the AI and our society with those goals are going to be. I think we have a broad vision, but the more specific we can be, the better.
And Erik, maybe as a way of closing this fascinating conversation, I've got 4 children. 2 of them are college age. One of them is studying to go into psychology in some form. Another one is studying to go into politics in some form. What advice would you offer them or your children or others who are not yet in the workforce but will be soon with all these changes afoot? What advice would you offer folks like that?
Well, it's a tough question. I do have kids, and I have similar conversations with them. One of them is working on brain science and neurology, one of them on data science, machine learning. One of them is a social worker, and actually the fourth one is also doing some machine learning and climate and weather prediction. And so they're all working on different aspects of this. Bits and pieces of it overlap explicitly with AI. A lot of it overlaps with changes in society. I have to be a little modest about specific advice because the technology in the world is changing so fast. So we wrote some things in Second Machine Age that we thought were lasting, and some of them have held up well, and others have faded a little bit as the technology improves. But some of the ones that have lasted well have been to lean into creativity, especially large-scale creativity, into leadership and management, into interpersonal skills and emotional intelligence. Back on the leadership and management, I think actually that's one that's going to become much more important in ways that I hadn't anticipated back when we first wrote it. I think in the near future, we're all going to be CEOs of fleets of agents. And as good CEOs of those agents, we'll have to define what the goals are for our network of AI agents. We'll have to define what the metrics are to measure their performance. We'll even have to find ways of motivating them. And those skills will carry over to some extent from managing humans. And it's something that we're all going to be doing more of. The other thing I would say is kind of a meta point that we have to be ready to adjust and update much more quickly than we used to because the technology is changing faster. The days of like figuring out what you're going to do and then, whether you're going to be a plumber or an economist or a venture capitalist for the next 40 years, that's probably not true anymore, that you're going to have to be ready to change around what you're doing. And no country, no company, no individual has ever succeeded by trying to just lock in and do the same thing over and over and preserve the past. We have to be willing to embrace the future, embrace change. That ultimately is a less risky approach, and it means leaning into learning, it means leaning into adaptability, it means leaning into dynamism as a society. We haven't been doing that as well as we used to, but if we could do more of that, I think we're going to ultimately have not just a more prosperous, but also prosperity that's more widely shared.
May I just ask you, Erik, I'm sorry, Warren, just before we wrap, does that have any, what you just said, does that have implications in your mind about how we think about education? What the
very much so.
are of education?
I'm an educator. I'm a professor here. One of my sons is teaching as well. And I think it's incredibly important. I'm voting with my feet on that. It's a mistake to think we can fully privatize that or leave it just to individuals to do all of that. Economists consider it a classic public good. Individuals often don't have the resources to make the kinds of investments that need to be made. Companies are not going to optimally invest either, and to get a little wonkish about it, there's firm-specific human capital that the company can capture a piece of that. That is some kind of investment that's only useful to that one firm. But most human capital, most education is broadly applicable to lots of different firms, and that means that if a firm invests in an individual, that person can take those skills elsewhere, which is fine, as they should. But it also means that the firm doesn't capture the full value and have the full incentive to make the investments. The way to solve that problem that economists and I think smart policymakers have known for centuries is for the public sector to step in. One of the reasons the United States was so successful going back to the 1800s was in the 1820s, we introduced primary, K through 6 education. Other countries kind of laughed at us and said, what are you doing there? Those people could be on the farm. But it turned out to be a good bet to teach people reading, writing, and arithmetic. And later there was the high school movement in the early 20th century. Later there's the GI Bill. And for a long time, the United States led the world in having measurably the most educated population. Big part of why it became the wealthiest country and also one of the most equal countries on the planet. Sadly, that's not true anymore. I would love to see us, renew our investment in education and skills and gain both the prosperity and the equality that comes with that.
Erik, you've proposed GDPB as a way to measure the digital economy's contribution to well-being. And first of all, I'd love for you to just explain to listeners who may not know what you mean by that, and then what you've learned from applying it and how it might change how nations track and value progress in the AI era.
Sure. The better we measure things, the better we'll be able to manage them. And for a long time, GDP, the traditional gross domestic product, has been our main metric of how we're doing. And it's great in many ways, invented back in the 1930s. It basically measures everything that's bought and sold in the economy. But there's a big flaw, and that is that if something has zero price, with few exceptions, it's invisible in GDP. And more of what we consume is stuff with zero or very low price. Like right now, we're on this video, and I consume a lot of Wikipedia. I get free ChatGPT. The average American spends about 8 hours a day looking at screens. Most of that is free goods consumption. So they're voting with their eyeballs to consume free stuff. That's not visible in GDP, but it does create value. People like it. So GDPB, the B stands for benefits, seeks to measure the value or the benefits people are getting rather than just the cost they're spending. And the way they do that is with an economic concept called the consumer surplus, which means what's the most you would have been willing to pay for something? Maybe you're willing to pay $30 a month for Wikipedia. How much do you actually have to pay? Zero. And that difference, $30, is the consumer surplus you get from it. If you do that for every digital good in the economy, you see that there's trillions of dollars of value that's being created and being measured by our new metric, GDPB, that's not visible in traditional GDP. Again, both of these are useful, but as the world becomes more digital, more AI powered, it becomes increasingly important to have metrics that capture that consumer surplus, not just the spending. So over time, I think we'll have a dashboard of multiple metrics, and we'll understand better where value is coming from.
Erik Brynjolfsson, thank you so much for joining us.
Real pleasure. Good talking to you both. That was fun.
Deval, what a discussion. I mean, a fascinating character, really one of the top thinkers on this topic.
Really thoughtful. He was, he had these wonderful rhetorical flourishes around, automation versus augmentation and so forth, but he was also very practical in thinking about, and kind of encouraging in thinking about, how to reframe productivity from just cost cutting to really enabling more creativity and innovation, which I believe exists in all of us.
Well, it's funny. We've heard now in some of these early discussions and in some of our research on this topic, I think people's minds when they talk about automation go first to cost cutting, but we're hearing, I think, more and more often now that augmentation, that really creating more and better products is really the path to economic glory. And I really hope that message sinks in, because that does seem like the path to not only better financial outcomes, but also better social outcomes.
Well, I think that's right. And Warren, I'd say I hope it's more than a message. I hope it's actually a practice. And as we get further along in conversations with some of our guests, maybe we ought to be asking more questions about what are you supposed to do as an employer or as a worker to start to think about how you use AI to enable you to flourish rather than just dodge it as a source of displacement. You know what I mean? And if we could be very, very specific in what that could be, as apart from just a reframing so that AI is a little less frightening for working people, but really a way to think about AI to enable people to have multidimensional lives and to bring all those dimensions to success at work.
Now, I will say that one of the things that struck me a little bit, Erik talked a lot about technology as a tool, and one where the impact of the tool depends a lot on our collective choices, which I very much agree and agree with. But he did say at one point, we asked him, if you take this technology to its furthest extent, we could all debate how long it's going to take before the technology develops to its furthest extent. But if you do, what room is there left for humans? And his reply to that was, well, I really like spending time with my family, and I've got lots of hobbies, so I'm sure we'll all be fine. That's for a man who's been as successful in his career as he has.
Right.
That struck me as an interesting response.
Yes. Well, yes, it presumes you don't need a paycheck. And of course, that is the source of so much anxiety for working people, right? About all automation. Now, you talked about the reactions to the word or the use of the term automation. I think for a lot of working people, that sounds like displacement is just on the horizon, and it gets back to the premise of this podcast series. How do we think about AI differently, not as a marketing approach, not as a messaging approach alone, but actually as a tool to enable people to get more out of their work and employers to get more out of workers, and also to free up parts of time and mind space for the things that give us joy.
Well, and I think, Deval, one of our guests coming up next week, I'm really excited to have Brian Deese, the senior policymaker in the Obama administration and the Biden administration, to talk about some of the potential policy responses. I think, that there is a world that one can imagine where AI really does free up a lot of our time and takes away some of our rote work. And there is a way where workers could have a stake in all of that. Mm-hmm. It feels to me like policymakers are going to have to think more deeply about this question if we're going to get to a better place on that.
Well, I think policymakers, yes, but also private employers, because even though I am a former policymaker, I've never thought every problem in everyone's life can be solved by policy alone. It has to be some combination and collaboration between public and private interests, and I think this is one where that collaboration could be natural.
Well, amen to that. And I think that goes back to what Erik's been talking about, technology as a tool that is still in our hands. And so with that, on to the news. According to the Financial Times, the AI will shrink the work week meaningfully. The Hollywood agent Ari Emanuel, Hollywood agent and sports tycoon, believes that AI will increase productivity and give people more time to go out and do stuff. He actually is positing with the Financial Times that our work week may be reduced to 2 or 3 days.
Bless his heart. If that is true and we get paid the same, or the cost of living doesn't increase, or you can get work at 2 days that you hadn't been able to get at 5 or 6 days, I hope that's true. A lot of other things have to be in balance, but I think his premise is that if you can, if you have a couple days to work, then you'll have more time to be in social settings. That would be a good thing, because loneliness is a huge challenge and issue in American life and in the American politics, to be sure, and in our society. Of course, some of this I remember from the rise of social media, right? It was going to actually make us more connected, and in many respects, it's done exactly the opposite. So if we use those extra days to look up from our phones, we might actually go bowling with each other. I could be hopeful about that, I guess. How about you?
Well, I will say about 25 years ago, I used to work in France. And in France, we had a 38-hour work week, and we also had 7 weeks of mandated vacation. And when I say mandated vacation, I don't mean suggested. I mean, they locked the doors for 2 weeks at Christmas and 2 weeks in August. And if you didn't take your other vacation days. Government bureaucrats came knocking. So this was and by the way, when you're in France, it's actually fairly easy to fill the time with fun stuff, or at least that was my experience. So
You were a fraction then of the age you are now, too, so I'm sure that was pretty easy.
that is true.
Warren, I've got one here from the New Yorker, an article that addresses the rise of the lumpen proletariat. And this is the idea of a permanent underclass. It's been embraced recently in part as an online joke, although I don't see what's funny about that, and in part out of a sincere fear about how AI automation will upend the labor market and create a new norm of inequality. What do you think about that?
Well, the first thing is the word lumpen I think it's a really good word. I'm not entirely sure what it means, although I did sort of feel lumpen this morning when I woke up. But I do think there's a reasonable cause for concern here. I know that folks out there talk about a world where increasingly capital can buy compute and make workers less relevant. And in a world like that, I think that, whatever concentration of wealth and power we've seen, increases in concentration over the past 10, 20, 30 years, I think you could see that being pushed even further. And so it does feel like something worth considering, especially, again, not as we think about what owners and investors can do, because I think that workers will be scared of this and they're going to need to be motivated in the face of these threats. Sharing some of the gains of productivity with workers, I think, will become even more important.
I think that's important. I think the whole idea of, permanent economic immobility is not just a theoretically unattractive idea. It's a threat to the American ideal. We talk about wealth inequality or income inequality today. I think it's mostly what folks are concerned about is that it's harder and harder to move from your station at birth to a better and more secure place, and that has been in part because of a bunch of different policy choices that we've made in our society that have just made that kind of economic mobility harder. That narrative is so central to the American story, the American expectation, and the frustration, I think, about how untrue that narrative has become for so many people in this country has contributed to the political discord that I think we're experiencing right now. So this, to me, is an issue of real urgency. And whether it is solved, again, by policy choices alone, by business practices alone, by personal choices and practices alone are several issues for debate. It's likely to be some combination of all of them.
Well, it's important that we attack this huge problem from all angles. But I will try to close out on a relatively optimistic note. So, according to the magazine Work in Progress, radiology is the perfect field for human replacement by AI. And in fact, as early as 2016, Geoffrey Hinton, who is known as the godfather of AI, he predicted that people should stop training radiologists now because there will be virtually no need for them in the future. But as of 2025, American radiology residency programs offered a record 1,200 positions across all radiology specialties.
Wow.
And today, radiology is the second highest paid medical specialty in the U.S. at over $500,000. So this is a field that people have been talking about going away for a long time, and it seems to be stronger than ever.
Well, I guess proving that even the godfather of AI can be wrong about AI, but I think just hoping that the naysayers or doomsayers will be wrong is not going to be enough. We've got to prepare. We've got to think about how you get ready for a world in which there is disruption at a minimum on account of AI. AI is very useful if I understand the technology at all, in basing predictions based on past behavior. But life is what happens while you're making plans. So it is possible that some of those predictions may be wrong. And what we want our reality to be is still within our control at various levels. And I think that's where I'm trying to think about the future of AI, how I prepare myself and my family and those I love and those I influence on how to prepare. And where I'm landing today, which may be wrong, and I'm not a technologist, is that the essential creativity of human beings is the thing that AI can't exactly replicate. The originality of human beings, the thing that enables whole new genres of music and painting and dance and writing and so forth to flourish, that are complete break from the past. There's still a room for that, and I think those same creative capabilities that happen in the creative arts that are brought into business settings and are the things, or can be, I should say, are the things that we should be trying to pay attention to and amplify.
Well, I certainly hope you're right, Deval. That's all we have time for this week. And so it's goodbye from my friend and co-host, Deval Patrick.
Over and out, and thank you, Warren Valdmanis. We'll see you next time.